see you.
The first question is about the latest tweet.
Oh, the latest tweet. Which one? My red shoes?
No, probably before that.
I tweeted my red shoes. I thought it was appropriate for Russia. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Considering another your tweet that you said that the last time you've been to Russia, it was 1967.
Yes, I'm the only one in this room that was alive then.
Yes. So, important question. You were a teenager.
That's a true statement, yes.
Yes. Middle of the Cold War.
Yes.
How does an American-Canadian teenager, come to Soviet Union during Cold War?
I had good connections. No, I went with a group of, eventually a group of students from around the world. And so I don't know how they arranged it, but we managed to come in as students. And it was part of a tour around Europe. I was in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and Moscow. And it was very different, you can be assured.
What were your impressions?
Well, it was the former Soviet Union was a very different country. As a North American, there were stores that you could only use American dollars for, and those were the only ones that had luxury items. The rest of the stores didn't, and it was surprising to me. I was also surprised by, I don't know if I can say this on TV.
It's not for TV.
Yeah, but it's okay. But there were two things. Actually, there were three very memorable experiences. One I hope to recreate. I went to see Lenin's tomb, which was a very impressionable. There were, at that time, and I don't know if there still are, there were lineups almost a mile long to see it. It was hours and hours and hours. But we got taken in specially. But it was dramatic. I hope to see if he's preserved as well now, 50 years later. The other was the fact that I had to pay for toilet paper in public washrooms from women who would be sitting in the bathroom, which was, as a teenager, was very significant. And my other memory, well, it's okay. Anyway, those are two example memories.
And
the other one,
no,
I think I'd better not say.
Okay.
But it was very different. It was a very different environment, and what was then a relatively closed society, but which was useful for me as a young man, was that that people's lives on a daily basis are not that different. People struggle to survive, people have friends, people party. And what was even better, maybe better than today, in a sense, the fake news then, everyone knew it was fake. Yeah. Everyone in the Soviet Union knew that what they were hearing was made up. And they used to listen to other things to get the news, but because BBC. But now you don't know what's made up. I just realized your T-shirt. My God. Okay, okay. Anyway, so that's an interesting thing that people knew what they were hearing was false, and now you don't know which is which. So
yeah. So that's the next question that you also tweeted, that you expect to see the changes.
I'm taking a picture of his T-shirt. I'm sorry, it's in the middle of you.
Okay.
Okay, so. This is good. I'm interrupting the PB program to take a picture. Okay, there we go. Good.
Actually, I was trying to pick
I'm gonna tweet your. Can I tweet the picture of you?
Yeah.
Okay. I will be tweeting.
So the second part of your tweet was about that you're expecting the changes. You've already mentioned one, not very positive.
Well, I haven't spent enough time to. I mean, the obvious change is just seeing the proliferation of stores and big companies and fancy signs and capitalism. Yeah. But I haven't spent enough time to really explore yet. Other than the fact, of course, that what we're doing right now wouldn't have been possible. The exchange of information around the world, the access to open information is profoundly important. And the press conference that we attended, again, that open information transfer would have been impossible in 1967. And it's an interesting difference. I wasn't certain. I didn't expect to be this frank about anything, but I am frank. So when I opened my computer last night at 2 a.m. after getting settled, I was very happy to see that I could access every site that I access back home. For instance, when I'm in China, I can't use Google. I can't get the New York Times. It shocked me to learn that things were so censored in China. I'm happy to see that isn't the case here.
We hope it won't get that bad. Speaking of changes, Russia, stuff like that, if I'm not mistaken, you're the chairman of the committee responsible for the Doomsday Clock.
Yeah.
And as I heard from you in one of your interviews, after recent political events, you moved the arrow.
We moved the clock 30 seconds closer to midnight, yes.
And what time is now?
It's now 2.5 minutes to midnight.
What was the reason?
One was clearly the election of Donald Trump. The fact that before the election, he made many statements about nuclear weapons that were inappropriate. At the same time, Vladimir Putin was making, and the Russian government were making much more aggressive statements about nuclear war. And Donald Trump said might use nuclear weapons in Europe. Crazy statements. Now, they were just words. And he's a man who says words without thinking. I don't know if there's any thinking involved at all in anything he does, but he certainly speaks without thinking. So one shouldn't read in too much. But actions speak louder than words. But when you're the new president of the United States, words matter. The same with Putin. The words may just be political posturing, but they're words nevertheless. So that tension that didn't exist, you don't remember, but the Cold War, there was huge tension. And I always thought once the Cold War disappeared that there was no need for these tensions anymore, that we could cooperate as partners. And it's sad to see that hasn't happened. So that was one important thing. The fact that Donald Trump didn't seem to also want to respect international agreements, suggested proliferation in Japan and South Korea, wasn't a fan of the nuclear weapons accord with Iran, which is very important. Those were one thing. The second was, well, when it comes to nuclear weapons, clearly we're also increasing tensions. North Korea developing ICBMs, and the world doesn't seem to know how to respond. But beyond that, there's the fact that in the United States, one party controls all three parts of government, and they don't accept the reality of climate change. It's the only major country, civilized country in the world, I think, industrialized country in the world, where the major controlling powers don't claim not to accept the reality of climate change. I don't know if in Russia the situation is different.
The climate change here, if I'm not mistaken, is not that big of a...
It may not be that big a deal. The question is, does the government deny it exists? And in the United States, they deny the reality of climate change.
Trump just signed off out of this agreement.
Exactly. But we made this decision before that happened. I think what's happened since has validated what we did in January. We argued that there was some concern about these things, and now the United States has pulled out of Paris. Paris was not much of a real agreement anyway. It was more words than actions. But it meant something, and it's unfortunate that the United States has backed out in a way. That effect may be positive because it may cause more people to think about how to enact the Paris Accords. But the world was not working very effectively to avoid climate change, and I'm very pessimistic about the future in that regard.
Yeah. By the way, speaking, if climate change is now a big part of this doomsday process, what can be done by people, by society, by us to move the arrow back?
Okay. Yeah. Let me just say there was one other thing that may be relevant for me to mention here. We've been looking at new technologies, emerging technologies, which is appropriate to the meeting I'm at now. And it was the first time we had emerging technologies play a role in our clock decision. That emerging technology was cyber warfare. The fact that in the American election, at least, there was the appearance of less of a confidence in democracy. That was a huge impact because it's the first time that it seemed to impact on the democratic process. One doesn't know if it'll get worse, but that was a factor. Now, the only way to address all three things, not just climate change, but all of these things, is for the public to get involved, the public to take the lead, because world leaders are not taking the lead. In all of these areas, the political leaders are failing miserably to address the real problems that are facing the world. Nuclear proliferation, climate change, and even in some sense the dangers of emerging technologies. So they are not taking the lead. The only way the governments will act is if the public vocally gets involved, which means we have to educate the public first, which is one of the reasons for the doomsday clock. But leaders, even whether democracy or not, leaders are moved by the public, not the other way around. So we need the public to indicate that they're fed up with no action on climate change, that they're willing to take action, carbon tax, that they're fed up with having Russia and the United States both have 5,000 nuclear weapons apiece, over 5,000, with 1,000 weapons on high alert, which means in 15 minutes they can be launched against one another, even with a false signal. That's stupid. In the modern world, there's no reason for that. There's no strategic benefit for that. Both Russia and the United States are going to spend billions, if not trillions of dollars modernizing their nuclear weapons fleet for no reason.
Just to
well,
have
but it'll
as
make
much
the
as
world
other
less safe. It won't make the world more safe. It'll make the world less safe. The only way we're going to move in the right direction is if the public indicates they care. Unfortunately, all of you in this room, other than me, and the camera can only see the two of us, but believe me, there's a lot of young people in the room. None of you have grown up in an era where nuclear weapons seemed like a threat in the sense that they were used. But we shouldn't be complacent, if you can understand that word. We shouldn't take it for granted. Nuclear weapons are an extreme danger, and the only way we'll avoid significant catastrophe is reducing nuclear weapons in all the world's countries. And I sadly think that it's quite likely that in this century nuclear weapons will be used against civilian populations. And it's unfortunate, but I can't see, I think it's the most likely possibility.
Where?
There's lots of possibilities for that. Could be terrorists. But it could be India and Pakistan have huge tensions. They both have lots of nuclear weapons. North Korea is an unknown. It's hard to know where it will happen, whether it'll be in a war between countries or used by some private groups. But the more nuclear weapons we have, the more dangerous the world is.
And
isn't that cheery?
Yeah,
okay,
yay, future is miserable.
Yeah.
Okay, you said actually about education, which is very important, and that's probably how people of science can do something. And
and people like you can do something. Hopefully things like this educate people about the issues. That's why I'm spending the time with you.
Yeah, we hope that. On lots of occasions, you and Neil deGrasse Tyson address the problem of how politics influences science, financing, control, legislation. How can science influence politics? And for example, can a scientist govern a country?
I don't see that a scientist is particularly any better governing a country than anyone else. Science can influence politics the way it should influence politics, which it should inform politics. Public policy should be based on empirical evidence. It's that simple. And so the public should demand that all of our public policies be based on science, in the sense that science is understanding the empirical world and using reason to make predictions. And that's the way, that should govern the way all of us act, and certainly should govern public policy. So I don't think scientists should make decisions. The public should make decisions in a democracy. But the public should be informed, and legislature should be informed, and the public should demand that their politicians and their leaders explain the evidence behind their decisions and what they're going to do, or be willing to say they don't know, which is really important. It would be a first in the history of politics for a politician to say, I don't know. But we should all be willing to say that. So science should inform public policy, and it's very unfortunate when governments don't turn to scientists, or when they censor scientists. It's happened in this country in the past. It's happening in the United States. Because then the public policy becomes nonsensical. If it's based on ideology or religion, then it's bound to be bad.
But in order for people to make their governments to follow science, people should follow science.
Well, that's the point. The first thing, I mean, look, you said education.
Yes.
I'm an educator, and there's an old expression I like to use, which is that if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Okay, and for me, the solution to most things is education. We need to educate the public on basic aspects of not the information of science, but how to think about science, the process of science. And it's really important to educate young people so they can use that, as I said in the press conference today, so they can use it to distinguish sense from nonsense when they read the internet, for example.
Do you have some tips, maybe as a teacher?
Yeah, sure.
Exact things, because there is no country with perfect educational system.
Yes, there
definitely
certainly
not US or Russia.
Yeah. Well, I wish I had a magic bullet and one simple way to do it. It's not so easy.
Okay,
it requires resources, first of all. The country has to be willing to spend money on teachers, first of all, and on the technologies that should be used in schools. But more important, teachers, it seems to me that we should be based teaching around questioning rather than answering. Questions, learning how to ask questions is the more important thing about the universe. And so teachers should be willing to say, when students ask a question, they should encourage them to ask questions. And then they should be willing to say, I don't know, let's find the answer, because then it becomes a process of discovery. So I think that in the modern world where there's so much information in a cell phone that you don't need to go to school to get that information, the teacher should be there to help encourage and motivate the students on navigating the minefield that is the world of information and learning how to ask good questions. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is a teacher should, well, I tell teachers that the biggest mistake any teacher makes is to assume their students are interested in what they have to say. But it's true of everyone. It's true of car salesmen. It's true in the world. If you want people to be interested in what you have to say, you have to go to where they are. That's why I wrote The Physics of Star Trek, for example, because people are interested in Star Trek. But so teachers should try and understand what interests their students and use that in their teaching process. But also teachers should use their own interests. Too often teachers think, I shouldn't talk about what I'm interested in. But if you don't convey your own interests, how can you expect anyone else to be interested? So I think that those are the tools. And be willing to not be an expert. Be willing to be wrong and be willing to not know the answer. And encourage kids to question. Questioning is the heart of science and learning. And too often kids go to school and are told facts and memorize them. That doesn't help you at all.
Very important question from a guy who's just finishing the school.
Is that you?
No.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately. So, Lawrence, as a teacher, what would you choose? Blackboard and chalk or whiteboard and a marker?
I like a blackboard and chalk. But that's because I'm a dinosaur.
Is it just easier?
Well, it's actually
big debate about that.
Well, here's one problem. You see, if you get chalk on your hand, you can wash it off more easily than the ink from a blackboard marker. So and if it gets on your clothes, you can just brush it off. So, but the nice thing about whiteboard and marker is that you can do many colors more effectively. I don't really think frankly, to be less sarcastic though about it, I don't think the technology matters. It's the content that matters. And I don't think you have to use modern technology to make too often people think if you don't do it on a computer with pretty pictures, people won't be interested. And in science programs, there's all these beautiful animations, but I don't think you need that. The ideas are interesting. The point of a teacher is to get students to think. And however you do that works. And if a blackboard works, fine. If just talking works, and more important, it's what the students do than what the teacher does that matters.
And what about inspiration and inspiring kids? How can you inspire a kid who, as you said, is not interested in what you're telling them to become a scientist?
Well, I don't think everyone has to become a scientist. First of all, we don't have to become scientists. We're all born scientists. Every kid learns about the world by experimenting, by playing, by testing, putting their fingers in flames and getting burned.
Biting stuff.
Yeah, everyone, children are natural scientists. What we do is we beat it out of them in school. So we just want to encourage that natural interest in solving puzzles and asking questions and exploring the world. And so I think but inspiring is to talk about amazing things. People are naturally interested in science. They just don't know what science they're interested in. So once again, if I try and connect to movies and talk about time travel or whatever, people are fascinated by science. They really just are. They're intimidated by it, and they don't realize that they can understand a lot of it. And so it's just a matter of of demonstrating how truly exciting it is, that the ideas are fascinating, that you don't have to be an expert. One of the big problems in our society is that you, at least in the United States, you can like music without being Eric Clapton, okay? You can like art without being Pablo Picasso. You can like plays without being Shakespeare. But for some reason, you're not supposed to like science unless you're a scientist. Because somehow you feel, well, I can't master it, so therefore it's not worth understanding. But I like music even though I can't play the guitar like Eric Clapton. I can still enjoy it. You can enjoy the ideas of science without being a scientist.
There was actually an exact question about that. I think it's from one of the subscribers. He said that to appreciate the beauty of a chess game, you need to know how to play. To appreciate the Shakespeare's work, you need to know English. What is the minimum knowledge needed to appreciate the beauty of science? Considering that science speaks math, and math is hard.
Well, math isn't hard. We pretend math is hard because people can do some basic math. People aren't willing to put the time in. But the listener is exactly right. To fully understand the science, you have to understand the math. But I disagree that you don't have to. I mean, you can enjoy the sound of music without being able to read the notes on a scale. You appreciate it more the more you understand. You take a Bach concerto, you can, if you listen to all the voices, if you appreciate that, if you know the music, it's obviously much more appreciation. But just you can decide that you like the art without knowing anything about it. And so I think that one can express in words many of the concepts of science. Now, you won't get it exactly. To appreciate it more, you have to understand the language of mathematics, but I think more people can. We give up too easily in mathematics. But the reason I write books, look, it would be a complete waste of time to have written all the books I have if I didn't think people could use it to learn more about the world. They won't get it exactly, but they'll certainly get a lot of it. And I think we need to use, it's a challenge to use words to communicate science often because the ideas are mathematical. But the challenge is an interesting one, and I found it enjoyable in my personal life. I've learned new ways to understand things that I thought I understood already by being forced to write it down and try and explain it to others.
Or we have this little anecdote, a joke, when one teacher tells another one, my students are so stupid. I explained them once, they don't get it. I explained them twice, they don't get it. I explained them 3 times. I get it. They don't get it.
Yeah. Well, no. As a teacher, indeed, often the only way to learn something is to teach it. Yeah. But I have a slightly different way of saying it. My students, the first time you see something in physics, you can't understand it, and the second time you say, "Oh, I've already seen it." It's okay, because part of it is intimidation. Part of it is from getting familiar, being less afraid. I think people are afraid, and that blocks their willingness to open their minds.
And that's actually where science communication, I think, plays a huge role.
I like to think so.
And so we also have some questions from subscribers of our friends, the big public. It's called Lintouch, and people were allowed to ask you some questions.
Oh, good.
So
hi.
Yeah. So one of the questions is, how can you become a science communicator? How to enlighten people and not to screw up? What simple people can do to counteract these processes that are like lack of critic thinking?
It's a big question. Look, we all can become evangelists for science. After all, there are many evangelists for religion. Yeah. All it means is ask questions. Ask yourself questions and ask others questions, and work together to try and understand. Encourage people to realize that science matters. So you can go into schools, you talk to your kids, and refuse to accept anything on faith. Refuse to accept things without evidence. If you're a young scientist, you should do science. If you're interested in communicating, you can take advantage of times to talk to small groups. But the more well-known you are as a scientist, the more opportunities you'll have. But I don't think every young scientist should run out and try and spend all their time communicating, because if they're talented, they should be doing the science. But I think what you should do if you want to communicate is practice.
And
just do it all the time. Most of the time, you won't be talking to anyone. I used to write many things when I was younger that no one would see. But I learned how to do it by doing it. Testing explanations to see if it worked with other people, friends, students. I worked at a science museum when I was a young person. That really helped. And writing, for the only way, in my opinion, to learn how to write is to write. Other than my books, when it comes to my public articles, for every article that you read, I may have written 20 articles that you didn't read. First of all, we all screw up on a daily basis. The one thing that I could have, and I don't like to give advice, but I'll give one bit of advice. Do not knowingly mislead. We all mislead. When I write an explanation of something that isn't exact, but I try and make it clear that it isn't exact, there's a great tendency to try and please the interviewer, to please people when they want it. You want to please them, and that there's a great tendency, therefore, to be led in directions that are inaccurate. If you're talking about things that you don't know much about, you should say it, and you should try never say anything that you know to be wrong. And people do it often, I'm afraid, just to please interviewers. That's the one thing I have no tolerance for. So that's how you don't screw up.
So another question from Lintouch subscriber. What is the most important question that you haven't found answer to?
Well, I try not. Everyone asks me for the most this, the most that, and I say I don't. It's just not the way I work.
The most.
No, but just so you know, because I will get asked other things. I don't have. I like many things, and I tried not to put them in a hierarchy. But there are fundamental questions that I would like to know the answer to. Is our universe unique? Is there one universe, or are there many universes? Are the laws of physics unique? Do they have to be the way they are, or can they change? Those are two big questions, fundamental questions about the universe that I would like to understand. Another question relates to something I was one of the first people to propose, which is the energy of empty space. Empty space has energy in it. We don't have the slightest understanding of why. I'd like to know why. But there are lots of questions I'd like to know the answer to. As a professional working scientist, like maybe I'll understand the nature of dark energy, or maybe I'll understand whether time existed before the Big Bang. But I'd also like to know things about how the brain works, and the universe fascinates me. So it's surprising, and I often say every day I'm surprised if I'm not surprised. I like to be surprised.
Are you planning on getting a Nobel Prize?
Look, it would be nice. Nobel Prizes are nice things, but I've learned that the prizes are very arbitrary. I've won many prizes. Some of them I deserve, some I may not. Some other ones that I may deserve, I may not get. So you can't be fixated on prizes. I'm very proud. Let me give you an example. So I was one of the first people to realize that maybe there was dark energy in the universe.
For that, for example.
Yeah, and then Nobel Prize was given to my friends who went out and discovered it. They proved that I was right. Well, that's nice. But for me, the greatest satisfaction was having been right, in a sense, for having, in a moment, realized something about the universe that no one else understood. That's the prize, ultimately. And Feynman said that once, and I didn't believe him. But I think it's true. If you're a scientist, the ultimate prize should be in understanding nature, and the rest is just arbitrary things. And of course, it's nice to get prizes and win money and be famous in certain ways, but those should not be the end goals. At least I hope not. And I hope they aren't for me, but you never know.
And speaking about undiscovered and some science, finally, if you take quantum mechanics, okay?
Everyone in the room is looking at their phones. It's such a neat thing. Anyway, sorry. Go on.
So if you look at quantum mechanics,
you all were. Yeah.
Quantum mechanics is weird.
It's very weird.
And probably that's where the true random is.
I don't know whether random. Quantum mechanics is weirder than you can imagine, and I've written about it.
Yeah.
But we should realize that there's something fundamental. The quantum mechanics is a deterministic theory. It's completely deterministic. Yes, the wave function is governed by what we call a second-order differential equation, which means if you give the initial conditions, its behavior for the entire future is completely determined. So the quantum mechanics itself is a deterministic theory. Measurements are probabilistic. So the wave function gives you the probability of making a measurement. So the measurements are probabilistic, but the underlying world is deterministic.
But the probabilistic measurements, which when the wave collapses into the particle,
whatever,
the wave
yes,
function. So basically, it becomes out of probability a fact.
Yeah, you can predict with 100% accuracy what the probability is that you'll make that measurement.
But you cannot predict.
But you can't predict what the exact measurement will be. And that is a true property of quantum mechanics, which in the practical world introduces uncertainties, and it's not complete randomness because the probability distribution is determined, but it means that you can't tell exactly what's going to happen when you do an experiment.
Is it possible that even that probabilistic thing will be uncovered sooner or later?
Well, yes. I mean, anything's possible, I suppose. But many people, starting with Einstein, did not like that aspect of quantum mechanics and thought maybe it was just a property of us not understanding the universe. There are many experiments and tests you can do to see if there's an underlying reality which is different than quantum mechanics, which gives you an exact answer. And all those tests have failed. And so it's very hard to imagine that the world at some fundamental level isn't governed by quantum mechanics, that it just isn't that way. That there's these theories called hidden variable theories, that maybe if you had access to information we don't have about the universe, you'd understand everything exactly. That's a nice thought, but all the evidence is to the contrary. And while people would like it, as I often say, the universe doesn't give a damn what you'd like. It doesn't care.
Calculations, mostly in quantum physics, I mean, all these theories, how to explain it, all even the double slit experiment, for example, how you interpret it, there are several interpretations.
Well, but the physics is clear. The interpretations are just words. And I have a real problem with the interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's often talked about. And I learned from a friend of mine at Harvard when I was there that it really should be the interpretation of classical mechanics. The real world is quantum mechanical. When you try and interpret it in terms of this illusion that we have that the world is classical, you come up with interpretations that sound crazy. But that's okay, because the real world is quantum mechanical. So any interpretation is going to sound weird, but it's just an interpretation. So I can interpret the double slit experiment to mean there are many universes, and every time I make an observation, I'm in one branch of the wave function, and all that sounds nice, but it's just words. The quantum mechanics is quite precise, and it tells you how the world behaves. And any interpretation is just that. It's like an interpreter. When I speak in English, in Russian, it's going to be an approximation, but it's not going to be the real thing. It's not going to capture the beauty of my language.
We'll try to make it as close as possible.
No, I'm sure you will.
Another interesting topic that you've talked about a lot, I would say, is the science and philosophy relationships. You're tired of these questions?
No, go on. I know where you're heading, but go on.
Yeah, there was one debate where I think it was called science versus philosophy or something, and you said that good philosophers, they agree with your attitude towards philosophy, and the bad ones don't.
Well, that's true, of course, but what I mean is...
Who are good and who are bad?
Well, look, what I mean is that, philosophy is a useful tool. Any critical thinking is useful. Philosophy is not a substitute for science. That's the point. And the philosophers that I would quote are good recognize that philosophy is useful at certain things, but it's not science. It's useful for reflection on knowledge, but the knowledge comes from science. The knowledge doesn't come from philosophy. Philosophy allows you to reflect on the results of science, which is empirical knowledge, and either interpret it for people or then ask better questions. Where philosophy is most useful is in formulating questions in areas we don't understand. So, for example, my friend Dan Dennett is a philosopher who, when it comes to cognition, there are so many things we don't understand about the way the brain works that I think philosophy can help us frame questions that will guide research. That's a useful area. But in physics, the philosophers don't frame questions that are useful for physicists. That just doesn't happen. The physics is so advanced that the questions are framed by physicists. The philosophical speculations become far removed. They're not read by physicists. They don't have any impact on physicists. And so it's not a value judgment. It's just a fact that physicists don't read the philosophy of physics. And philosophers aren't the ones who are guiding the questions that physicists ask. It's physicists. That's just because physics is really an advanced field where the questions have become pretty well defined and mostly determined by experiment. And that's just the way it is. And some philosophers take that as an offense, but I don't mean it as such. But when it comes to fundamental physics, progress is made by physicists and not philosophers. And as I once again say, that pure thought isn't knowledge. It's a reflection on knowledge. But philosophy as a discipline, the discipline required to think logically and consistently and look for contradictions, that's a very important area of human activity. And we're all philosophers in that sense. Physics used to be called natural philosophy for a reason. So physicists in some sense practice philosophy, but we all do. And we all can become better philosophers by forcing our thinking to be rigorous and critical and use the tools of philosophy. So as a tool, the tools of philosophy, which is rational thinking and logical analysis, need to be applied to empirical evidence. But all of that I encompass in science.
Another question from our friends from Lintach. I don't know if you know or not, recently theology has become an official science in Russia.
And, that's such a shame.
And even the first PhD, there is now a guy who has PhD.
There's no excuse for having theology in universities. It's not an academic discipline. There's no contribution to knowledge in the last 500 years that's come from theology. I've asked theologians to give me one example of a contribution to knowledge that's come from theology. And I don't mean the standard, certainly the history of religion is a contribution to knowledge, understanding where they came from and that sort of thing. But pure theology has given no insights into the universe, first of all, or into understanding of ourselves. And when I've asked theologians to give me an example of the contribution to knowledge in the last 500 years, the answer I get is always the same. What do you mean by knowledge? And that's a deep epistemological
philosophical question.
Well, yeah, I know, but what it means is that they don't have an answer. If I asked a psychologist or a chemist or a physicist what contributions to knowledge, they wouldn't give me that answer. They'd give me an example of quantum mechanics. You give me, or whatever, or evolution, natural selection. The only reason they give me that answer is because they don't have an answer. Theology is, it's true that science may have grown out of it, but it's literally grown out of it, just like children grow out of their parents. And so it is unfortunate. There's no place in universities for the study of theology because other than the interesting aspects of understanding the historical or linguistic, culturally, all of that, but the actual content of theology is so empty that to call it a discipline is an affront to all real disciplines.
What about psychology? You're fine with it?
No, psychology, sometimes no, sometimes yes. But certainly, especially, I'm a biggest fan of experimental psychology. There's a lot of interesting experiments you can do on the brain. What I'm always worried about in any aspect of science is pushing it beyond the domain of validity. Okay, there's physicists who talk about consciousness, but physics has nothing to say about consciousness right now. And so I'm dubious about psychological claims that aren't supported by evidence. But that's true in a lot of fields. But there are many areas of psychology that are fascinating. And as I say, experimental psychology, which is really an emerging discipline as we have more tools to analyze brain function, functional MRI, and all sorts of new tools, becomes more interesting all the time. So certainly, sometimes psychology is a science, not always. and we need to know the difference.
Going a little bit back to the question of theology and religion, we just have to discuss this topic.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about it. I'm not really, but I'm willing to.
But interesting question again from our subscribers. I think, can you imagine the world without any religious people, like 100% atheist world?
Well, I can imagine anything. I get paid to imagine. That's what I get paid. But it may not correspond to reality. I like to distinguish between an imaginary world and a real one. So I think religion has a deep basis in evolution, in evolutionary psychology. Obviously, it fulfills a human need, and pretty well every society has a religious belief because we're hardwired to want to believe. We're hardwired to have what's called teleology, to find purpose to things. And the evolutionary explanation, I think, is relatively simple, that in the ancient savannas of Africa, that if the trees were rustling or the leaves were rustling, you could do two things. You could say there's no reason for it, or you could say there's a lion behind it. And those of our ancestors who didn't think there was a lion behind it never procreated. So we have this need to find explanations for things. And I think we need to recognize that as humans we find that need. So religion, if religion didn't fulfill fundamental human needs, it wouldn't be so prevalent and so long-lived and so robust.
But
But the question is, do we need it? Are there other things that could supplant it? And I would like to think that I can imagine a world in which would be a better world in which we didn't need fairy tales to live our lives. And an example of such a world is the world of Star Trek, for example, right? In the far future, they don't have religion on this Enterprise. And everyone is versed in science, and they don't have and they thus realize that all the artificial barriers, religions tend to pull people apart instead of bringing them together. Science brings people together. So I think I'd like to imagine a world in which people found meaning that they created. And a sense of community didn't require a religious belief, but a sense in the common understanding of us as human beings. So I can imagine a world, which I do think would be a better world, in which people force their beliefs to conform to the evidence of reality rather than the other way around.
That would be nice.
Well, it would be, I think.
But complicated also.
Well, yeah, but do I think it's likely in the near future? No, I think, as I say, religion is it's power. It's not just, look, religion is an institution in the modern world, in the advanced world, and institutions like to preserve their existence.
Yeah, sure.
And so religion is big business and many things. So it's hard to imagine, and religion, the other unfortunate thing is that religion has access to young people, which is really unfortunate. That parents feel somehow that taking their children to church is a good thing, when in my opinion it's that kids are too young to understand subtle questions about existence, and when you force these lies on them when they're young, it's hard to get over it. So religion has the access to the young, and as long as religious institutions have access to young people, they're not going to disappear.
Speaking about the kids and the religion, and lots of the times it's like an argument for religion and for these fairy tales, like, okay, how do you explain death to a child? So if without any fairy tales, how can you explain to a child that someone close have died?
Well, look, we all have to be sensitive to what kids can appreciate and what they can't. But to give them a lie, just to make them happy, well, it's okay as long as we're willing to realize eventually they get to a point where we say, you know what, that was what we just told you before. Let me give you the example. Many of us tell our kids about Santa Claus. I don't know if in what you use in Russia, but in the United States we have
Ded Moroz.
we have Saint Nicholas or whatever it is. Whatever it is, or the Easter Bunny. I don't know which of the myths you use here. So we do that because it's fun for the kids, but we don't. But we make it clear to them eventually that it's just for fun when they were younger. And I think you could talk to kids sensitively without introducing myths that are unnecessary. And maybe it makes a kid happier to know that someone who's gone still exists somewhere. But I think you can say that in a way that's less. For example, the people that are gone exist in your memory. They exist forever in the memory of their loved ones and their children and their children's children. So we can preserve their existence that way. And maybe that's as consoling to a child as saying they exist in some fairyland somewhere else. But even, I understand that parents want their children to feel better, and we're all parents and we all screw up in that regard. But I think ultimately the best thing all you can ultimately do is encourage kids to think for themselves. So even if you give them a myth, if you're a good parent, what you should do is encourage them to question at what you say eventually. Not when they're 5, but by the time they already begin to when they're teenagers naturally anyway. But the best thing you can do is encourage them to think for themselves and not impose beliefs that they should take with them without asking themselves whether there's a reason for those beliefs.
Speaking of death and stuff.
Wow. Okay, let's talk about death.
Neil deGrasse Tyson once said that he wants to be buried, not cremated, for certain reasons.
Oh, really? Neil said that?
Yeah, or he was asked, like, if you don't believe in afterlife, what do you believe in? He said, well, I believe that I will like rot in
Yeah,
the ground.
yeah.
So please bury me so my nutritions can go to the plants where I got them.
Oh, okay.
What about you? How would you prefer to be buried?
I don't really give a damn, but one thing I wouldn't want to do is occupy any additional resources that could be taken otherwise. So I wouldn't want to require land area that can be used for other things. So I wouldn't want it to take up any space.
Mm-hmm.
As I think about it, Neil has a point in the sense that cremation seems to me to be the best way. But I guess in a world of climate change.
And it's a waste of energy and matter.
Well, we produce a lot of carbon in the atmosphere so I guess I'd like to be cremated as long as all the carbon could be recycled and stored in other forms, and maybe used for heating purposes in cold climates. But I don't have any concerns about that. It's not something I spend a lot of time on, but it's an interesting issue.
Yeah. And the final question.
But Neil could feed a lot more people than I could, so it's okay.
Yeah. Famous Russian and Soviet scientist and communicator Sergei Kapitsa. Maybe you know him or his
Kapitsa,
dad.
the physicist Kapitsa?
Yes,
Yeah.
his son, I think.
Oh,
They
his
both
son.
were famous scientists. So he used to have a talk show, and in the end, he asked his guests, scientists, to make a prediction, to tell their vision of the world in N years, and they used to pull the paper. Do you have any predictions?
No. I make no predictions except for about anything less than 2 trillion years in the future. And there are many reasons for that. First of all, it is actually interesting and simple to talk about what the universe will look like 2 trillion years in the future.
Is it called death?
Well, it may. I've written a lot about it. And in the universe, we become cold, dark, and empty. Probably, but we can't prove it. But I like to, that's the first reason. The second is no one will be around to check to see if I'm wrong. But in the nearer term, I think all predictions miss the most important things. All predictions about the future miss discoveries, because if we knew about them, they wouldn't be discoveries. So when you predicted what the world would be like in 2017, in 50 years ago, you didn't predict the internet, which is what is the basis of the show we're doing right now.
Well, some writers did.
Very few. Most science fiction writers talked about flying cars or talking with your minds, but very few, almost no one predicted the internet in the form that we use it nowadays. And I think the real discoveries that we've made are discoveries. That's what makes the world exciting, that we don't know what the future brings, because that's why it's worth doing science, because the world is a surprising place. And so anything I predict now means it's based on my knowledge now. But the great thing about being a scientist or being a human is that 10 years from now, I'll know things I didn't know now. And I much prefer to be surprised, because that makes the world an exciting place for me to wake up in every morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Verdader has like 200,000 and 300,000 subscribers. So maybe you have something...
Almost as many followers as I have.
Yeah,
Anyway, go on.
combined, yeah.
Anyway.
So, thanks to you partly, we have all of these people.
Good. I'm
Maybe
serving
you
a
have
purpose.
anything, just a couple words to encourage all the subscribers, the viewers, all the people who are in Russia.
Yeah,
interested
sure.
in science.
This is. Do you want me to look at it?
Yeah.
It's worthwhile